Dutch Van Der Linde is one of the most fascinating psychological train wrecks in gaming, and I mean that in the best way possible. Because if you've played Red Dead Redemption 2, you've watched this man slowly, methodically fall apart. And it's not just villain goes crazy storytelling, it's a genuinely realistic depiction of how narcissism, paranoia, and delusion can destroy someone from the inside out. Dutch starts the game as this charismatic leader with a vision, the philosopher outlaw, the man with a plan. And by the end, he's completely lost in his own head, convinced everyone's betraying him, making increasingly unhinged decisions until there's nothing left but the collapse. Today, we're doing a full psychological breakdown of Dutch Van Der Linde. We're talking about narcissistic personality traits, paranoid thinking, how his ego defenses completely fail under pressure, and why his famous "I have a plan" becomes more delusional every time he says it. Let's go. Part 1. The narcissist, grandiosity, and the fragile ego. Alright, so let's start with the foundation. Dutch Van Der Linde has severe narcissistic traits, and I'm talking about clinical narcissism here, not just he's kind of full of himself. In psychology, narcissistic personality disorder has some key features: grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with fantasies of power and success, need for excessive admiration, sense of entitlement, lack of empathy, exploitative behavior. And Dutch, he checks basically every box. His grandiosity is obvious from the start. He sees himself as this revolutionary visionary, not just an outlaw, a philosopher, a liberator, a man destined to save his people from the corruption of civilization. "I have a plan" isn't just a statement, it's his identity. He's the man with the vision, and everyone else needs to trust him and follow. He constantly talks about Evelyn Miller, about philosophy, about the moral superiority of their lifestyle. He's not a criminal in his own mind, he's a freedom fighter, an artist, someone operating on a higher moral plane than regular people. That's textbook narcissistic grandiosity, the inflated self-image that needs constant reinforcement. And you can see how he needs admiration. He gives these speeches to the gang, and he's watching for their reaction. He needs them to believe in him, to look up to him, to validate his vision of himself. When they do, he's energized. When they don't, that's when things start going wrong. Because here's the thing about narcissism, that grandiose exterior, it's covering up deep insecurity. The ego is actually incredibly fragile. It needs constant propping up through external validation. There's this psychologist named Heinz Kohut who talked about this. Narcissists need mirroring. They need other people to reflect back their idealized self-image. Without that mirroring, the whole structure starts to crumble. And that's exactly what happens to Dutch. As Arthur starts doubting him, as people start questioning his decisions, as the gang starts falling apart, he's not just losing followers, he's losing the mirror that tells him he's the great leader he believes himself to be. That's narcissistic injury, and Dutch does not handle it well. Part 2. Splitting, the black and white world. Now let's talk about a specific psychological defense mechanism that Dutch uses constantly. It's called splitting. Splitting is when you see people as either all good or all bad. There's no middle ground. Someone's either completely loyal and perfect, or they're a traitor and enemy. You can't hold the complexity that someone might be good in some ways and flawed in others. This is really common in people with certain personality issues, particularly what psychologists call borderline organization. And Dutch does this constantly. Look at how he treats people. When you're on his good side, you're perfect. You're family. You're the most loyal, most capable, most important person. He idealizes you completely. But the moment you question him, the moment you show doubt, you flip. Suddenly you're a traitor. You're against him. You're the enemy. There's no nuance. No Arthur's loyal but has some valid concerns. It's just Arthur's betraying me. This is psychological splitting, and it gets worse as the game progresses. Early Dutch can still hold some complexity, but by the end, it's extreme. You're either with him completely or you're against him completely. Micah is the perfect loyal son. Arthur and John are traitors. There's no in between. And this connects to another concept from psychoanalytic theory. Otto Kernberg talked about how underneath narcissistic grandiosity, there's often this primitive splitting. The person can't integrate good and bad aspects of themselves or others, so they split the world into idealized and devalued objects. For Dutch, his gang members aren't complex human beings. They're either mirrors that validate his greatness or threats that challenge it. And as his paranoia increases, more and more people move from the mirror category to the threat category. Part 3. Paranoia, when everyone becomes the enemy. Alright, so let's talk about Dutch's paranoia, because this is where he really starts to lose it. Paranoia in the psychological sense is persistent suspicion without sufficient basis. You doubt everyone's loyalty. You read hidden meanings into innocent actions. You think people are plotting against you. You hold grudges and perceive attacks where none exist. And Dutch descends into this completely. Early game Dutch has some healthy caution. He's an outlaw leader, some suspicion makes sense, but as things progress, it becomes pathological. He starts seeing betrayal everywhere. Arthur's concern becomes treachery, John's doubts become conspiracy, everyone's out to get him. Now psychologically, what's happening here? There's a defense mechanism called projection. Projection is when you take your own unacceptable feelings or impulses and attribute them to other people. So Dutch is becoming more deceptive, more power hungry, more willing to betray the gang's principles for his own ego. But he can't acknowledge that about himself. That would shatter his grandiose self-image. So instead, he projects it outward. He's not the traitor. They are. He's not betraying the gang's values. They're plotting against him. This is a classic paranoid defense. You externalize your own shadow side and then hunt it in others. And once this starts, there's a cognitive feedback loop. Psychologists call it confirmation bias. Once you believe people are against you, you start interpreting everything through that lens. Arthur suggests a different plan. That's not just disagreement. That's evidence he's undermining you. John wants to protect his family. That's not love. That's betrayal of the gang. Every ambiguous action gets interpreted as hostile. And that interpretation reinforces the paranoid belief, which makes you see more threats, which reinforces the belief even more. It's a downward spiral, and Dutch is in freefall by the end of the game. Part 4, Cognitive Dissonance and the Delusion. Now let's talk about the plan, because Dutch's obsession with having a plan, with Tahiti, with one more score, that's not just optimism, it's a psychological defense against cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is what happens when you hold contradictory beliefs or when your actions contradict your self-image. It creates psychological discomfort, and people will go to extreme lengths to reduce that discomfort. For Dutch, there's a massive contradiction at the core of his identity. He believes he's a moral person, a liberator, someone fighting for freedom and justice against a corrupt system. But his actions, increasingly violent, increasingly harmful to innocent people, increasingly destructive even to his own gang. That creates dissonance. I'm a good person versus I'm doing terrible things. So how does he resolve it? By doubling down on the plan. See, if there's a plan, if there's a purpose, if this is all leading somewhere good, then the bad things are justified. They're not really bad. They're necessary sacrifices for the greater goal. It's not that he's a bad person doing bad things. He's a visionary making hard choices for the eventual paradise. Tahiti becomes this psychological escape hatch. As long as Tahiti exists as a future possibility, he doesn't have to confront the present reality. There's actually research on this. Social psychologist Leon Festinger studied a doomsday cult that predicted the end of the world. When the world didn't end, did they admit they were wrong? Number. They doubled down. They found new explanations. They became more committed to the belief. That's Dutch. Every time the plan fails, every time they don't get to Tahiti, he doesn't question the fundamental premise. He just needs one more score. The plan is still good. It just needs more time, more money, more loyalty. This is ideological delusion as psychological defense. As long as he can maintain belief in the plan, he doesn't have to face the truth that he's been lying to himself and everyone else for years. Part 5. The Manipulator. Antisocial features. Now, we need to talk about the darker side of Dutch's psychology. Because he's not just narcissistic and paranoid, he's also manipulative in ways that overlap with antisocial personality traits. Antisocial personality disorder involves things like lack of remorse, manipulation of others for personal gain, superficial charm, impulsivity, and rationalizing harmful behavior. And Dutch has a lot of these features. His charisma is real, but it's also a tool. He uses his charm, his speeches, his philosophy to manipulate people into following him, into doing what he wants, into staying loyal even when everything's falling apart. He shows very little genuine remorse. People die because of his decisions, and he rationalizes it. They chose this life. It was necessary. We had no choice. He doesn't take responsibility. He doesn't feel guilt the way someone without these traits would. And his moral reasoning is completely self-serving. He talks about principles and freedom, but those principles get bent or discarded the moment they become inconvenient. The ends justify the means, always. There's a term in organizational psychology for this type of leader, the narcissistic antisocial leader. They're charismatic and visionary, which attracts followers, but they're also exploitative and manipulative, which ultimately destroys the group. And that's Dutch perfectly. He built the gang through charisma and vision, and he destroys it through manipulation and ego. Part 6, the collapse, when the defenses fail. Alright, so what happens when you combine narcissism, paranoia, cognitive dissonance, and antisocial manipulation, and then put it all under extreme stress? You get Dutch in the final chapters of RDR2. You get complete psychological collapse. As the gang falls apart, as people start leaving, as Arthur openly challenges him, all of Dutch's psychological defenses fail at once. His narcissistic need for admiration, not being met. People are doubting him, leaving him, seeing through him. His paranoid projections, they're not preventing the actual betrayals and disasters. In fact, they're causing them. His cognitive dissonance management through the plan. It's not working anymore because they're never getting to Tahiti and everyone knows it. What you're seeing in late game Dutch is what psychologists call ego disintegration. The psychological structure that held his sense of self together is falling apart. And when narcissists experience this kind of collapse, when the grandiose self can no longer be maintained, it can look almost psychotic, not actual psychosis, but a kind of reality distortion where they become increasingly delusional, increasingly disconnected from how things actually are. Dutch in Beaver Hollow is barely recognizable from Dutch in Horseshoe Overlook. He's paranoid to the point of delusion. He's making wildly irrational decisions. He's completely lost in his own narrative where he's still the visionary leader and everyone else has betrayed him. This is narcissistic collapse and it's devastating to witness. Part 7, the final moment, rage turned inward. Let's talk about Dutch's final moments, his self-annihilation at the end of RDR1. From a psychological perspective, this is the ultimate endpoint of his collapse, and it can be understood in a couple of ways. First, there's narcissistic rage. When the narcissistic self is completely shattered, when there's no way to maintain the grandiose identity anymore, that rage has to go somewhere. Usually it goes outward in destructive acts, but it can also turn inward. Dutch's action is rage turned against himself. The world won't validate his vision. His gang is gone. John, his surrogate son, hunted him down. There's no audience left to perform for, no mirrors left to reflect his greatness, so he destroys the one thing left, himself. But there's another layer. This can also be a final attempt to control the narrative, to choose the ending on his own terms, to not be captured or defeated by John and the government, but to exit the story himself. In that sense, it's a last narcissistic act. You didn't beat me, I chose this. Either way, it's the inevitable conclusion of a psychological trajectory that started with grandiosity and ended with complete collapse. Part 8. What Dutch represents. So what's the bigger picture here? Why does Dutch's psychology matter beyond just understanding one video game character? Because Dutch represents a type of person that exists in the real world. The charismatic leader whose ego eventually destroys everything they built. We see it in cult leaders who lead their followers to destruction, in political figures who become increasingly paranoid and authoritarian, in CEOs who burn down their own companies rather than admit fault, in family patriarchs who tear their families apart maintaining control. The pattern is always similar. Grandiosity and charisma attract followers. Narcissistic need for validation creates dependence on loyalty. Paranoia emerges when control is threatened. Cognitive dissonance produces increasingly elaborate justifications, and eventually, the whole structure collapses. Dutch is a perfect case study because RDR2 shows us the whole process. From the idealistic beginning through the gradual deterioration to the final collapse. And it does it with enough psychological realism that it feels true. He's not just the villain who went crazy, he's a recognizable personality type following a recognizable psychological trajectory. And that's what makes him so compelling and so disturbing. Because we've all probably known someone like Dutch on some level. Maybe not an outlaw gang leader, but someone with that combination of charisma and narcissism and paranoia. Someone who started with vision and ended in delusion. And watching Dutch is watching what happens when those traits go unchecked, when there's no insight, no therapy, no intervention, just the logical endpoint of a disordered personality under stress. So there it is. The psychology of Dutch Van Der Linde. Narcissistic personality traits with grandiosity covering deep insecurity. Splitting that divides the world into perfect loyalists and evil traitors. Paranoid projection that sees his own shadow in everyone else. Cognitive dissonance managed through delusional planning, antisocial manipulation masked as philosophy, and eventual complete psychological collapse when all the defenses fail. Dutch is a masterclass in psychological realism. Rockstar didn't just create a villain, they created a clinical case study of how personality pathology manifests and destroys. And what makes it tragic is that Dutch probably could have been different, with insight, with help, with different circumstances, but he never got there. He stayed trapped in his own ego defenses until they consumed him. That's the real horror of the character. Not the violence he commits, but the psychological prison he built for himself. The way his need to be right, to be admired, to be the visionary leader, it destroyed him and everyone around him. Arthur sees it, John sees it, we as players see it. But Dutch never does. He dies still believing in his own narrative, still the misunderstood genius betrayed by lesser men, and that's the final tragedy. Complete psychological collapse without any moment of insight or redemption. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want more psychological breakdowns of game characters, drop suggestions. I'll catch you in the next one.